300 mansions, all in one neighborhood, all occupied by millionaires. Brush Park wasn't just wealthy, it was legendary. People called it the Little Paris of the Midwest. In the 1880s, this Detroit neighborhood was home to some of the most expensive real estate in America. Architects from around the world came to build masterpieces here. The streets were lined with elms, the lawns were perfect, every house was a palace. Then it died. Completely. By the 1980s, Brush Park was a wasteland. Burned-out mansions, boarded windows, streets ruled by crime. Of those 300 palatial homes, maybe a dozen survived. The rest? Demolished, abandoned, rotting where they stood. Everyone thinks they know why. The automobile, they say. White flight. Detroit collapsed, so the neighborhood collapsed with it. But those aren't the real reasons. They're symptoms. The real story is more complicated, more deliberate, and more devastating than most people understand. This is the story of how America's grandest neighborhood was systematically destroyed. Not by accident, not by economic forces alone, but by specific choices made by specific people. And how, against every odd, a few survivors are bringing it back. Before we dive in, drop a comment below. Have you been to Detroit? What do you think happened to neighborhoods like Brush Park? And if you're fascinated by stories of rise, fall, and resurrection in American cities, please subscribe and give this video a like. Your support makes these deep dives possible. Now, let's go back to the 1850s, when Brush Park was just a farm, and one man had an idea that would change Detroit forever. The neighborhood that shouldn't have died. Here's what doesn't make sense. Brush Park had every advantage a neighborhood could have. Perfect location. Close to downtown Detroit, but far enough for quiet streets and clean air. Beautiful natural setting, tree-lined avenues, spacious lots. Wealthy residents with unlimited resources. Architectural masterpieces that should have been treasured and preserved. Other wealthy neighborhoods from the same era survived. Boston's Beacon Hill is still prestigious. Chicago's Gold Coast never collapsed. San Francisco's Nob Hill remained wealthy through earthquakes and economic crashes. Even in Detroit, neighborhoods like Indian Village and Palmer Woods maintained their character and property values. So why did Brush Park die? Walk through what's left today, and you'll see the ghosts. Ransom Gillis House, a Gothic revival mansion with towers and elaborate stonework, sat abandoned for decades, its roof collapsed, its interiors destroyed by weather and vandals. It's been restored now, but barely. For every house that's been saved, 9 others are gone. Completely gone. Not converted to other uses. Not repurposed. Demolished. Erased. The empty lots tell the story louder than the survivors. Where the George Jerome House once stood, a Beaux Arts masterpiece with Eastlake influences across its limestone facade, there's nothing. Just grass. Maybe a parking lot. The foundation is gone. The stone was hauled away or buried. It's as if the house never existed. 300 mansions. Think about that scale. This wasn't a few rich people building big houses scattered across a city. This was concentrated wealth, block after block, creating a neighborhood unlike anything else in America. The lots were enormous. Double lots were common. The houses were custom designed by renowned architects. Money was no object because the residents had unlimited money. Elisha Taylor, one of the nation's most powerful attorneys, built a Gothic revival mansion on a double lot. In his later years, he'd dress in a tuxedo and top hat and wander the streets. Neighborhood children would escort him home, treating him like beloved royalty. That house? Gone. James Campbell built a stately home that looked almost understated compared to its neighbors, which is saying something, because it was still a mansion. Gone. Albert Eugene Fay White's Italianate residence on a premium corner lot with hitching posts for horses and perfectly manicured grounds? Gone. One by one, these architectural masterpieces vanished. Not over centuries, over decades. The collapse was fast, brutal, and seemingly unstoppable. By the 1950s, the neighborhood was unrecognizable. By the 1980s, it was a war zone. But here's what makes this particularly tragic. Brush Park died while Detroit was still wealthy. The neighborhood was already collapsing in the 1920s, when Detroit was booming as the automobile capital of the world. The mansions were being converted to boarding houses, while Henry Ford was creating the middle class. That's the mystery. This wasn't a neighborhood killed by its city's economic collapse. The timing doesn't work. Brush Park died first, decades before Detroit's well-known troubles. Something else killed it. Multiple things, actually, working together to destroy what should have been permanent. The conventional explanation, automobiles allowed people to move to the suburbs, is too simple. Yes, that happened. But it happened everywhere in America, and most wealthy urban neighborhoods adapted. They converted mansions to apartments or offices. They attracted new residents. They changed but survived. Brush Park didn't adapt. It collapsed. Completely. Why? The second explanation, white flight after the 1967 riots, is also too simple. The riots accelerated abandonment, certainly, but they can't explain why the neighborhood was already dying 40 years earlier. The riots were in 1967. The mansions were becoming boarding houses in the 1920s. What killed Brush Park between 1900 and 1967? And the third explanation, Detroit's economic collapse, doesn't work either. Detroit filed for bankruptcy in 2013. Brush Park was already a ruin by 1980. The city's collapse came after the neighborhood's collapse, not before. So what's the real reason? Why did Brush Park die when it had every advantage, every reason to survive? Why did 300 mansions vanish from one neighborhood while other wealthy areas adapted and endured? The answer isn't simple. It's not one thing. It's a combination of geography, economics, racism, urban planning disasters, and deliberate policy choices that systematically destroyed a neighborhood over decades. And understanding what really happened to Brush Park tells us something important about how American cities succeed and fail. But first, we need to understand what Brush Park was at its peak. Because you can't comprehend the tragedy of its collapse without understanding the magnificence of what was lost. The Golden Age, when Detroit was America's Paris. 1850. Detroit is booming. The city's population is exploding as immigrants flood in seeking opportunity. Construction is constant. New buildings, new homes, new infrastructure. The city that was once a modest Great Lakes port is becoming an industrial powerhouse. But with growth comes problems. The downtown core is dense, noisy, dirty. Factories belch smoke. Streets are crowded. The wealthy residents who'd built comfortable homes near the city center are looking for escape. They want space, quiet, clean air. But they also want convenience. They can't move too far from downtown where their businesses are located. That's when Edmund Brush sees an opportunity. Edmund's father, Elijah Brush, had been Detroit's second mayor. Back in 1806, when Detroit was still a frontier town, Elijah purchased a long, narrow tract of land just north of the city center. He used it as a family farm. Good farmland, close enough to the city to sell produce, but far enough out to be peaceful. By the 1850s, that far enough out had become at the edge of the expanding city. Edmund Brush stood on his family's farmland and saw the future. This wouldn't be farmland much longer. Development was coming whether he wanted it or not, so he'd control that development. He'd create not just a neighborhood, but a planned community for Detroit's elite. His plan was revolutionary for mid-1800s America. Wide avenues, far wider than typical city streets, lined with elm trees. Large lots, minimum sizes enforced. Only substantial homes allowed. No modest houses, no commercial buildings, no mixed use. This would be purely residential, purely upscale, purely beautiful. He called it Brush Park, and he marketed it brilliantly. This wasn't just land for sale, this was membership in Detroit's most exclusive community. Buy a lot in Brush Park, and you were declaring your arrival among the city's elite. The wealthy responded immediately. Lots sold quickly. And the buyers weren't just rich, They were ambitious. Each wanted their house to be more impressive than their neighbors. Competition drove architecture to new heights. Architects flooded into Detroit. Some came from the East Coast, trained in New York or Boston, bringing sophisticated Eastern styles. Others came from Europe, German craftsmen, Italian stonemasons, French designers. Brush Park became a showcase for architectural talent from around the world. The result was architectural chaos, in the best possible way. No two houses looked alike. Every mansion was unique, designed specifically for its owner's taste and built to showcase the architect's skills. Gothic Revival mansions with pointed arches and elaborate stonework stood next to Italianate villas with towers and wide eaves. Queen Anne homes with turrets and wraparound porches competed with Renaissance Revival palaces featuring symmetrical facades and classical details. Second Empire mansions with mansard roofs sat beside Romanesque castles with rounded arches and rusticated stone. It shouldn't have worked. That much architectural variety should have created visual chaos, but somehow it did work. The wide streets gave each house room to breathe. The large lots provided context. The elm trees unified everything with green canopy. The result was spectacular, a neighborhood where every block offered new visual delights. By the 1880s, Brush Park had earned its nickname, the Little Paris of the Midwest. And for once, the nickname wasn't hyperbole. This genuinely rivaled European boulevards in beauty and sophistication. The neighborhood wasn't just homes. Religious buildings sprouted throughout. Temple Beth El, designed from solid stone blocks with imposing architecture demanding permanence, served the Jewish community. The First Presbyterian Church towered overhead with Romanesque proportions dwarfing human scale. These weren't modest neighborhood churches. These were architectural statements, built to last centuries. And there was Irving Elementary School, the prestigious institution where every Brush Park child, regardless of their parents' religion or background, attended together. The school became the neighborhood's social hub, where the next generation of Detroit's elite was educated and socialized. By the 1890s, Brush Park had reached its peak. Over 300 mansions occupied the neighborhood. Every lot was developed. Every house was occupied. The streets were immaculate. The residents were among America's wealthiest and most powerful. Take a walk down Alfred Street in 1890, and you'd experience concentrated opulence that few places could match. The wrought iron fences perfectly maintained. The lawns manicured by professional gardeners. The carriages parked outside, not just any carriages, but custom-made vehicles that cost more than most people's houses. Russell McLaughlin grew up in Brush Park during these golden years, attending Irving Elementary, playing on these perfect streets. Decades later, he wrote about his childhood memories. On a summer's evening, there was no front porch unoccupied. The front porch brought all these neighbors into a single, close-knit community, as if one pleasant sitting room had stretched, quite unobstructed, for a quarter mile. That description captures something important. This wasn't just a wealthy neighborhood, it was a community. The residents knew each other. Children played together. Families socialized on front porches every evening, creating an extended neighborhood family. Before ice cream trucks, a man named D. Peters would sing in the streets while his pony pulled a popcorn wagon. Neighborhood children would hear him singing and come running from their houses, penny in hand, to buy fresh popcorn. Simple pleasure, but it illustrates the neighborhood's character, safe, connected, alive with daily rituals. The men of Brush Park weren't just wealthy, they were powerful. They ran Detroit's industries, its banks, its law firms. They made decisions that affected thousands of workers and millions of dollars. They were Michigan's elite, and Brush Park was their fortress. The women of Brush Park managed households that were essentially small businesses. A typical mansion required multiple servants, maids, cooks, gardeners, drivers. Hosting dinner parties for 20 wasn't unusual. Managing the social calendar, maintaining standards, representing the family and society, it was a full-time job. This was the peak. This was Brush Park at its absolute zenith, 1890 to 1900 roughly. A neighborhood that seemed permanent, invulnerable, destined to remain Detroit's crown jewel for generations. Everyone who lived there believed it would last forever. The houses were built to last centuries. The wealth seemed inexhaustible. The social structures felt eternal. This was the natural order, the successful rising to the top, building beautiful things, creating communities that would endure. They were wrong. Within 20 years, the collapse would begin. Within 50 years, the neighborhood would be unrecognizable. Within a century, it would be ruins. But the conventional explanations for that collapse, automobiles, white flight, Detroit's economic troubles, don't tell the whole story. They don't explain why Brush Park died while other neighborhoods survived. They don't reveal the real reasons this seemingly invulnerable community was systematically destroyed. To understand that, we need to examine the lies everyone believes about what killed Millionaire's Row. The lie everyone believes. Ask anyone what happened to Brush Park, and you'll hear the same answer: the automobile. It sounds logical. Henry Ford's assembly line revolutionized transportation. The Model T made cars affordable for the middle class. Suddenly, people could live farther from their workplaces. The suburbs exploded. Wealthy families abandoned urban mansions for sprawling estates in places like Grosse Pointe and Bloomfield Hills. Brush Park emptied because everyone drove away. Simple, clean, wrong. Yes, automobiles changed where people lived, but they changed it everywhere in America, and most wealthy urban neighborhoods adapted. They didn't collapse, they evolved. So why didn't Brush Park? Look at Boston's Beacon Hill. Same era, similar wealthy residents. When automobiles arrived, some families moved to the suburbs, but others stayed, or new wealthy families moved in. The neighborhood transitioned, certainly. Some mansions were converted to apartments or professional offices, but it remained prestigious. Today, Beacon Hill is one of America's most expensive neighborhoods. The automobile didn't kill it. Chicago's Gold Coast? Still wealthy, still prestigious. The automobile didn't destroy it. New York's Upper East Side? Thriving. The automobile didn't empty it. Even in Detroit itself, other wealthy neighborhoods survived the automobile era. Indian Village, just a few miles from Brush Park, remained upscale. Palmer Woods maintained its character. Boston Edison kept its wealthy residents. These Detroit neighborhoods faced the exact same transportation revolution that supposedly killed Brush Park. They survived. Some are thriving today. So the automobile can't be the complete explanation. It's part of the story, certainly, but something else must have made Brush Park uniquely vulnerable. Let's look at the timeline. The Model T launched in 1908. Ford's assembly line began in 1913. Mass automobile ownership started in the 1920s. If cars killed Brush Park, we'd expect the neighborhood to decline starting around 1920 to 1930. And it did decline then, but not because wealthy residents left for the suburbs. They'd already left. The mansions were already being converted to boarding houses by 1920. The decline started earlier, before mass automobile ownership. Something else began the collapse, and automobiles just accelerated it. Here's what really happened with the automobiles. They gave wealthy residents options they didn't have before. In 1900, if you were a Detroit business leader, you had to live relatively close to downtown where your office was located. A horse-drawn carriage could only go so far. Brush Park was perfect, close enough for a short commute, far enough for quiet and space. By 1920, with automobiles, that distance calculation changed. You could live 10 miles out and still reach downtown in 20 minutes. Suddenly, Brush Park's location, once perfect, became merely adequate. Why settle for a half-acre lot in Brush Park when you could have 5 acres in Grosse Pointe with lakefront access? But that same logic applied to every urban neighborhood. Automobiles made suburbs accessible everywhere. Yet only some urban neighborhoods collapsed while others adapted. The automobile was an opportunity for people to leave, but it wasn't a reason they had to leave. Beacon Hill residents could have left. They had automobiles. They had money for suburban estates. Many stayed because the neighborhood remained desirable. It offered things suburbs couldn't: walkability, culture, proximity to urban amenities, historic architecture, established community. Brush Park offered those same things. Historic architecture? Check. 300 architectural masterpieces. Established community? Check. Decades of wealthy residents who knew each other. Proximity to downtown? Check. Even better than most neighborhoods. So why did everyone leave? Because something made Brush Park less desirable than it had been. Something changed that made wealthy residents want to flee. That made the neighborhood feel wrong, unwelcoming, finished. The automobile gave them the means to leave, but something else gave them the motivation. Look at what happened to the mansions after the wealthy left. They didn't sit empty. They didn't get demolished immediately. They were converted to boarding houses, to multi-family rentals, to cheap housing for workers. By 1920, every single mansion on Alfred Street had been converted to boarding houses where factory workers rented rooms. Think about that. These weren't abandoned buildings waiting for new wealthy owners. They were immediately repurposed for working-class housing. There was demand for housing in Brush Park, just not from wealthy residents. The neighborhood's location was still convenient for people working in Detroit's factories. The mansions, divided into small rooms, could house dozens of workers cheaply. So the problem wasn't location. It wasn't proximity to jobs. It was something about the character of the neighborhood, the type of neighbors, the direction of change. Something made wealthy residents unwilling to stay even though the location remained practical and the architecture remained beautiful. The automobile gave them an escape route. But they were fleeing from something, not just towards something. And that something wasn't just the suburbs are nice. It was deeper, more disturbing, and much more deliberately engineered than a simple story about transportation technology. The automobile explanation is comfortable. It's neutral. Just technological progress changing how people live. Nobody's fault. Nothing sinister. But comfortable explanations are often incomplete. The automobile didn't kill Brush Park. It was the getaway car for people fleeing something else. And that brings us to the second lie everyone believes. That white flight killed the neighborhood. This explanation has more truth to it, but it's still wrong about the timeline, wrong about the causes, and wrong about who's responsible. The second lie, white flight killed it. The 1967 Detroit riots, 5 days of violence, 43 people dead, thousands injured, entire neighborhoods burned. It's one of the most traumatic events in American urban history, and its effects on Detroit are undeniable. After 1967, white residents fled the city in massive numbers. The population collapsed, tax base evaporated, services declined. The city entered a death spiral that took decades to escape. And Brush Park, people say, was a casualty of that white flight. The riots scared away anyone who might have invested in the neighborhood. The violence confirmed that Detroit was too dangerous for wealthy residents. The remaining structures were abandoned, vandalized, destroyed. By the 1980s, Brush Park was a wasteland. True, right? The riots killed Brush Park. Nope. Look at the timeline. The riots happened in 1967. Brush Park was already effectively dead by then. The mansions had been converted to boarding houses in the 1920s, 40 years before the riots. They'd been declining throughout the 1930s and 40s. By the 1950s, most were in serious disrepair. The 1967 riots didn't kill Brush Park. They just finished off a neighborhood that was already dying. This isn't to minimize what happened in 1967. The riots accelerated Detroit's decline dramatically. They triggered massive population loss that devastated the city. But they can't explain Brush Park's collapse because the neighborhood was collapsing long before 1967. So let's talk about the real white flight, the one that happened decades earlier, the one nobody talks about because it's less dramatic and more uncomfortable. Brush Park's original residents were overwhelmingly white and Protestant. That was intentional. Restrictive covenants and informal agreements kept out Jews, Catholics, and certainly black residents. This was standard practice in wealthy American neighborhoods of that era. Discriminatory, yes, but also stable from the residents' perspective. Everyone was the same. Everyone knew everyone. The community felt cohesive. In the 1910s and 1920s, Detroit's black population exploded. The Great Migration brought hundreds of thousands of black Americans from the South, seeking jobs in Detroit's booming automobile factories. The city's black population increased by 600% between 1910 and 1930. They needed housing, and they were restricted to very specific neighborhoods by both formal policies and informal violence. Brush Park was adjacent to some of these designated black neighborhoods. Not in them exactly, but close. Close enough that the boundary was ambiguous. Close enough that black families seeking better housing might attempt to move into Brush Park's mansions, especially as they were being converted to multifamily dwellings. The wealthy white residents of Brush Park watched this demographic change with horror. Their exclusive neighborhood was being invaded in their racist terminology. Property values would collapse, they believed. Crime would increase. Their children would be unsafe. Every racist fear of the era was activated, so they left, not because suburbs were inherently more attractive, not because automobiles made it convenient. They left because they were fleeing demographic change. They were fleeing integration, or even the possibility of integration. This is the white flight that killed Brush Park, not the dramatic 1967 version everyone remembers. The slow, deliberate, racist abandonment of the 1920s and 30s. The wealthy white residents could have stayed. The neighborhood was still structurally sound. The mansions were still beautiful. The location was still convenient. But they chose to leave rather than live near black neighbors. And this wasn't just individuals making housing choices, it was systematic. Real estate agents practiced racial steering, showing white clients only suburban properties, showing black clients only designated neighborhoods. Banks redlined Brush Park, refusing mortgages to anyone wanting to buy there. Insurance companies raised rates or refused coverage entirely. The entire financial infrastructure of housing worked to ensure Brush Park couldn't attract new wealthy residents. The mansions converted to boarding houses not because there was no demand from wealthy buyers, but because wealthy white buyers were systematically directed elsewhere, and wealthy black buyers were prohibited from purchasing by both law and custom. By 1930, Brush Park had become what urban planners call a transition neighborhood, code for a formerly white area becoming accessible to black residents. And in the 1930s America, that designation was a death sentence for property values and investment. No bank would lend, no insurance company would cover, no wealthy family would buy. The neighborhood was locked into decline before World War II even began. So yes, white flight killed Brush Park, but it was the white flight of the 1920s and 30s, driven by racism and enabled by discriminatory lending, not the 1967 flight driven by riots. But even this explanation is incomplete, because it doesn't explain why the mansions weren't preserved, why they weren't converted to other uses, why they were demolished rather than adapted. Racism explains why wealthy white residents left. It doesn't fully explain why the buildings themselves were destroyed. Other neighborhoods experienced demographic change and survived. Harlem's brownstones transitioned from wealthy white to wealthy black ownership. Brooklyn's townhouses changed hands, but remained structurally intact. Even in Detroit, some neighborhoods managed demographic transitions without losing their housing stock. Brush Park didn't just change demographically, it was physically destroyed. Most of the 300 mansions don't exist anymore. They're not occupied by different people. They're gone, erased. And racism alone doesn't explain demolition. Economic abandonment doesn't explain bulldozers. Something else happened. Something more active, more deliberate. Someone made decisions that resulted in the physical destruction of these buildings. And those decisions weren't made by residents fleeing or demographics changing. They were made by city planners, highway engineers, and politicians who looked at Brush Park and decided it wasn't worth saving. That's the real reason Brush Park collapsed. Not automobiles providing an escape route, not even racism driving residents away. The real reason is that Detroit made deliberate choices. Policy decisions, infrastructure investments, urban planning priorities that systematically destroyed the neighborhood. And those choices have names. They have dates. they have paper trails. The destruction of Brush Park wasn't an accident or an inevitable result of economic forces. It was planned, funded, and executed by people who thought they were building Detroit's future by demolishing its past. The location nobody wanted. Here's what nobody talks about. Brush Park had a location problem from the very beginning. It just took decades for that problem to become obvious. When Edmund Brush developed the neighborhood in the 1850s, he chose land that was perfectly positioned for that moment. Close to downtown, convenient for business. Far enough out, space for large estates. It was the Goldilocks location for 1850s Detroit. But cities grow, and as Detroit grew, Brush Park's perfect location became problematic. Look at a map of Detroit in 1900. Brush Park sits just north of downtown, maybe a mile from the city center. To the south, downtown business district, increasingly industrial. To the east and west, working-class neighborhoods surrounding the factories. To the north, open land that would become future suburbs. Brush Park was sandwiched. It wasn't on the waterfront, that prime real estate along the Detroit River where the absolute wealthiest built estates. It wasn't far enough north to be truly suburban. It was in between, and in between is a terrible place for a luxury neighborhood. Compare this to Grosse Pointe. When wealthy Detroiters started leaving Brush Park, where did they go? Grosse Pointe, lakefront property on Lake St. Clair, 5 miles east of downtown. They didn't just move to bigger lots. They moved to fundamentally better locations with water access, natural beauty, and distance from industrial Detroit. Or compare to Bloomfield Hills 15 miles north. Rolling terrain, lakes, forests. When you moved to Bloomfield Hills, you were moving to a different landscape entirely. Not just farther from downtown, but genuinely rural, spacious, separate. Brush Park couldn't compete with those locations. Once automobiles made them accessible, Brush Park's advantages disappeared. You couldn't add a lakefront to Brush Park. You couldn't move it farther from industrial areas. You couldn't change its fundamental geography. And that industrial proximity became increasingly problematic. Detroit's factories weren't clean, quiet operations. They were loud, smoky, dirty. The air quality near industrial Detroit was terrible. Coal smoke, chemical fumes, metal dust. The noise was constant. Machinery running day and night, train whistles, factory horns. By 1920, Brush Park wasn't a retreat from urban life anymore. It was surrounded by urban life. The downtown that had been a mile away had crept closer. Industrial areas had expanded. The quiet streets with clean air that Edmund Brush had promised were compromised. Not destroyed exactly, but definitely degraded. Wealthy residents noticed. Why stay in Brush Park, dealing with urban proximity, when you could move to Grosse Pointe and wake up to lake breezes? Why tolerate factory smoke when Bloomfield Hills offered forest air? The location that had been perfect in 1850 was merely acceptable by 1920 and unacceptable by 1930. But here's the crucial part. This location problem didn't have to kill the neighborhood. Plenty of urban neighborhoods close to industrial areas remained valuable because they adapted. They couldn't compete for the ultra-wealthy, so they attracted the upper middle class, or converted to commercial use, or became cultural districts. Cities are dynamic, neighborhoods change, but they don't have to die. Brush Park could have become an enclave of apartments for young professionals. The mansions could have been converted to office space for lawyers and doctors. The location was actually perfect for those uses, close to downtown, convenient, in beautiful historic buildings. But that adaptation never happened. Why? Because Detroit wouldn't allow it. Or more accurately, Detroit actively prevented it through zoning decisions, infrastructure investments, and urban renewal policies that made Brush Park's adaptation impossible. The location problem made Brush Park vulnerable, but it was the city's response to that vulnerability that killed the neighborhood. And that response has a name: urban renewal. Detroit chose cars over people. The 1950s and 60s were the era of urban renewal in America. Cities across the country were tearing down blighted neighborhoods and replacing them with highways, parking lots, and modern developments. The theory was that old, deteriorating buildings were holding cities back. Demolish them, start fresh, build for the automobile age. Detroit embraced urban renewal with particular enthusiasm. The city was the automobile capital of the world. Cars were Detroit's identity, its economy, its future. So when federal highway funds became available, Detroit's planners knew exactly what to do. Build freeways that would let automobile owners bypass the city center entirely, living in suburbs and commuting through Detroit without ever stopping. And those freeways needed to go somewhere. They needed rights of way through the city. And the cheapest, easiest rights of way were through neighborhoods that already had declining property values. Neighborhoods like Brush Park. The Chrysler Freeway, I-375, was planned in the 1950s. The route cut directly through the southern edge of Brush Park. Dozens of mansions sat in the path. The city's response? Demolish them. Not preserve them, not relocate them, not route the highway around them. Just demolish. The official justification was that these were blighted properties. And technically, many were in poor condition by the 1950s. Decades of deferred maintenance, conversion to boarding houses, declining investment. The mansions weren't pristine anymore. But blighted is a convenient label. It means the city can condemn properties through eminent domain, pay minimal compensation, and bulldoze without public outcry. Except these weren't just any buildings. These were architectural masterpieces, irreplaceable craftsmanship, historic landmarks, and the city treated them like disposable obstacles to highway construction. The Chrysler Freeway wasn't the only infrastructure project that destroyed Brush Park. The Woodward Widening Project expanded Woodward Avenue, Detroit's main north-south thoroughfare, into a massive road designed for high-speed automobile traffic. The widening required demolishing buildings along Woodward's edge. More mansions gone. And even beyond direct demolition for highways, the infrastructure projects made the neighborhood fundamentally unlivable. Imagine trying to maintain a beautiful residential neighborhood when an interstate freeway has been built through it. The noise, the pollution, the visual blight of elevated concrete, the fact that your street no longer connects to the street 2 blocks over because a highway cut through. The city didn't just take some buildings, it destroyed the neighborhood's coherence. Brush Park went from a connected, walkable community to a fragmented collection of blocks separated by infrastructure. You couldn't stroll from one end to the other anymore. You had to cross highways, navigate new traffic patterns, deal with neighborhoods that had been physically severed from each other. And there's more. Urban renewal wasn't just highways, it was also slum clearance, demolishing what the city deemed substandard housing and replacing it with modern developments. Brush Park, with its aging mansions converted to boarding houses, was a prime target. The city condemned entire blocks, demolished dozens of buildings simultaneously, created vast empty lots that were supposed to attract new development. And then, nothing. Because who was going to invest in a neighborhood that the city had just declared blighted, that was now surrounded by highways, that had lost its historic character? The empty lots sat vacant for decades. No development came. The city had destroyed the neighborhood in order to save it, and ended up with neither old buildings nor new investment. Just absence. But even this doesn't fully explain the totality of Brush Park's destruction, because some buildings survived the highways. Some blocks weren't in the path of urban renewal. Yet those buildings rotted too. Those blocks declined too. The entire neighborhood collapsed, not just the parts that were demolished. Why didn't private owners maintain the surviving buildings? Why didn't anyone invest in restoration or adaptive reuse? Why was abandonment total rather than partial? Because the third piece of the puzzle made restoration economically impossible. The buildings themselves had become financial traps that nobody could afford to escape. Nobody could afford to save it. Imagine you own a mansion in Brush Park in 1960. Maybe you inherited it from your parents. Maybe you bought it cheap in the 1940s hoping to restore it. Doesn't matter. You own a 50-room Victorian Gothic mansion that hasn't been properly maintained in 40 years. What are your options? Option 1. Restore it to original glory. You'd need to replace the roof. That's $100,000 minimum in 1960 dollars, maybe $1 million today. Update the electrical system throughout 50 rooms. Building code requires it, and the existing wiring is literally a fire hazard. Update the plumbing. Repair the foundation where it's settled. Replace windows. Refinish floors. Repair plaster throughout. You're looking at $500,000 in 1960 dollars, equivalent to $5 million today. And at the end, you'd have a beautifully restored mansion in a declining neighborhood. It would never appraise for what you spent. Option 2. Convert it to apartments. This was economically viable in many cities. Historic mansions became multi-unit housing, generating rental income that justified maintenance costs. But in Brush Park, the economics didn't work. The neighborhood was too far gone. Rents were too low. Nobody wanted to rent apartments in Brush Park. You'd spend hundreds of thousands converting the building and never recoup the investment. Option 3. Commercial conversion. Turn it into offices or retail space. But Brush Park was surrounded by vacant buildings and declining commercial areas. No business wanted to locate there. The conversion cost would be enormous. Commercial buildings have different code requirements than residential, and you'd have an empty commercial building in a neighborhood with no commercial activity. Option 4. Sell it. To whom? Nobody's buying 50-room mansions in declining neighborhoods. Even if you found a buyer, what price could you get? The land value was near zero. The city had basically declared the neighborhood worthless through its actions. The building value was negative. It cost money to maintain or demolish. You couldn't give it away. Option 5. Abandon it. Stop paying taxes. Stop maintaining it. Walk away. Let the city eventually take it for back taxes. This is what most owners eventually did, because it was the only economically rational choice. Maintaining the building cost money with no return. Demolishing the building cost money. Walking away cost nothing. So Brush Park filled with abandoned buildings. Not because owners were callous, but because they were trapped. The buildings were financial black holes. Every dollar spent on them disappeared with no return. The economically rational choice was abandonment. And once abandonment started, it accelerated. An abandoned building next door makes your building worth less. Why invest in restoration when the building next door is rotting? Why try to attract tenants when the street is lined with boarded-up buildings? Abandonment created more abandonment in a death spiral that consumed the neighborhood. The city didn't help. Property taxes on these large buildings were substantial, based on their original size and lots, not their current value. Owners who wanted to maintain buildings faced high taxes on properties that generated no income. It was cheaper to abandon and let the city seize them than to keep paying taxes on worthless assets. And demolition? Even demolition was too expensive. Tearing down a 50-room mansion cost tens of thousands of dollars. If you can't sell the land afterwards, and nobody was buying land in Brush Park, demolition is just throwing money away. So buildings stood, rotting, because demolishing them made no economic sense. The city could have intervened. Tax breaks for restoration, low-interest loans for rehabilitation, zoning changes to enable adaptive reuse, historic district protections that increase property values through preservation. Other cities did these things and saved their historic neighborhoods. Detroit did the opposite. The city's actions, highway construction, urban renewal demolition, neglect of infrastructure, made restoration economically impossible, then blamed property owners for not maintaining buildings that were financial traps. By the 1970s, Brush Park was an economic dead zone. The buildings couldn't be restored profitably. They couldn't be demolished affordably. They couldn't be sold. They could only be abandoned. And so they were, one by one, until the neighborhood was a landscape of ruins. This is the real reason Brush Park collapsed. Not automobiles, not white flight. A three-part catastrophe, a location that became less desirable as Detroit grew. Deliberate destruction through urban planning that prioritized highways over neighborhoods, and economic conditions that made preservation impossible and abandonment inevitable. 300 mansions didn't just disappear. They were systematically destroyed by city policies, abandoned due to financial impossibility, and left to rot because saving them made no economic sense in the context Detroit created. But here's what's remarkable. Some buildings survived anyway. Against every economic incentive, against all odds, through decades of abandonment and decay, roughly a dozen mansions in Brush Park refused to fall. And understanding why those specific buildings survived and what it took to save them tells us something important about preservation, economics, and the power of individuals to fight institutional failure. The survivors, mansions clinging to life. Of the 300 original mansions in Brush Park, maybe 12 survived to the year 2000 in any recognizable form. 12. That's a 96% loss rate. But those 12 survivors are fascinating because they reveal what it took to outlast Detroit's collapse. Why did these specific buildings survive when their neighbors didn't? The Ransom Gillis House is the most famous survivor. Built in 1876, it's a Gothic revival masterpiece. Limestone walls, elaborate stone carving, tower with pointed arches, the kind of building that should be in a fairy tale. It survived because of one factor: location. It sat on a corner lot, highly visible, on a block that wasn't completely devastated. Visibility mattered. Buildings hidden on interior blocks where nobody went could rot unnoticed. But the Ransom Gillis House faced a relatively active street. People saw it, and occasionally someone cared enough to prevent its demolition. That's not the same as preservation. For decades, the Ransom Gillis House was a ruin. The roof failed in sections, letting rain pour in. Interior plaster collapsed, floors rotted, vandals broke every window and tagged every wall with graffiti. By 2000, calling it a building was generous. It was a shell, but it was a standing shell, which put it ahead of most Brush Park mansions. The Stimson House survived for different reasons. Built in 1888, it's a Romanesque revival mansion with rounded arches and elaborate stonework. It survived because someone kept paying taxes. Across decades of decline, through changes in ownership and periods of vacancy, someone, trustees, heirs, legal entities, kept paying the property taxes. That prevented the city from seizing it and potentially demolishing it. The building deteriorated, certainly, but it remained legally owned and therefore not immediately threatened. Property taxes sound like a minor detail. They're not. Most abandoned Brush Park buildings reverted to city ownership after owners stopped paying taxes. Once the city owned them, they became liabilities. The city had to maintain them or demolish them, and demolition was cheaper. Continuous private ownership, even by people who couldn't afford maintenance, provided a barrier against demolition. The city couldn't just tear down privately owned buildings without cause. The Rizzio House survived through stubborn construction. Built in 1874, it's a Second Empire mansion with a distinctive mansard roof. Second Empire buildings are structurally robust. Thick masonry walls, solid foundations, quality materials. The Rizzio House deteriorated like everything else in Brush Park, but it deteriorated slowly. The walls didn't collapse. The foundation held. Even without maintenance, the building's core structural integrity remained. It could be restored, theoretically, if anyone had the money and motivation. Other survivors had similar stories: corner lots that stayed visible, owners who maintained tax payments, construction so solid it outlasted decades of neglect. But surviving to 2000 wasn't the same as being saved. These buildings were ruins. Restoration would cost millions per building. The neighborhood was still dangerous, still economically depressed. Nobody was lining up to pour millions into restoring mansions in Detroit's worst neighborhood. The survivors clung to existence, but they had no future. Or so it seemed. Then, in the mid-2000s, something changed. Not dramatically. Detroit didn't suddenly become prosperous. Brush Park didn't suddenly become desirable. But a few things happened that created the possibility of preservation. First, the city of Detroit finally acknowledged that letting historic buildings rot was bad policy. In 2005, The city allocated funds to stabilize some of the surviving Brush Park mansions. Not restore them, just stabilize them. Put on temporary roofs, board up windows properly, shore up walls at risk of collapse. The investment was modest, maybe a few $1,000s per building. But it prevented imminent collapse and bought time. Second, preservationists began arguing that Brush Park's ruins had value as ruins, not as restored mansions, that was too expensive, but as historic remnants worth protecting. The buildings told Detroit's story: rise, fall, abandonment. That story had power. Maybe the buildings could be stabilized as ruins, interpreted for tourists, generating income through historical tourism rather than residential use. Third, and most importantly, a few individuals decided these buildings were worth saving, regardless of economics. Not because restoration made financial sense, it didn't. But because these buildings mattered. They represented craftsmanship, history, Detroit's past glory. Losing them entirely would be cultural suicide. Among those individuals was Nicole Curtis, a DIY enthusiast and preservationist with a TV show called Rehab Addict. She'd made a career restoring historic homes in Minneapolis. Then she learned about Brush Park. She saw photos of the Ransom Gillis house, that Gothic revival masterpiece collapsing in ruins, and decided it could be saved. Everyone told her she was crazy. The building was too far gone. The neighborhood was too dangerous. The costs would be astronomical. She'd never recoup her investment. Restoration was impossible. She started anyway. And what happened next changed Brush Park's trajectory in ways nobody expected. The TV show that changed everything. Nicole Curtis purchased the Ransom Gillis house in 2013. The price? $16,000. That sounds like a bargain for a mansion until you see what $16,000 bought. A pile of limestone and rotted wood held together by hope and architectural genius. The roof was 90% gone. Rain had poured through for decades, destroying everything below. The interior was rubble, collapsed plaster, rotted floors, demolished staircases. Every window was broken, every door was gone. Vandals had stripped anything valuable or sellable. What remained was structure, the limestone walls, the foundation, the basic form of the building, and barely that. Curtis documented the restoration on her TV show Rehab Addict. Each episode showed the brutal reality of restoring a century-old ruin. This wasn't HGTV fantasy where everything works out in 30 minutes. This was years of work, millions of dollars, constant setbacks, and small victories measured in inches. Finding craftsmen who could replicate 1876 stone carving? Nearly impossible. Finding materials that matched the original limestone? Difficult and expensive. Dealing with city permits, inspections, building codes that didn't anticipate someone restoring a Gothic mansion? Bureaucratic nightmare. But Curtis persisted. She fundraised. She documented every step. She showed viewers not just the building's restoration, but Brush Park's history. The Golden Age, the collapse, the abandonment. She made people care about a building most of Detroit had forgotten, and crucially, she stayed in the neighborhood. Even when restoration was months or years from complete, Curtis lived in Brush Park. She walked the streets. She met the neighbors, the few residents who'd never left, who'd stayed through decades of decline. She showed that Brush Park wasn't just ruins. It was a community, small and struggling, but still there. The restoration took years. Curtis faced constant criticism. She was gentrifying the neighborhood, critics said. She was prioritizing a mansion over affordable housing. She was doing this for TV ratings, not genuine preservation. Some criticism was fair. Restoration is complicated, and priorities matter. But Curtis completed what many thought impossible. She saved the Ransom Gillis house. By 2017, the building was restored. Not perfectly. Compromises were necessary. Not completely. Some interior work remained. But the building stood. The roof was solid. The windows were glazed. The stonework was repaired. You could walk through it and see what it had been, what it could be again. And something unexpected happened. Other people noticed. Investors, preservationists, architects, they started looking at Brush Park differently. If the Ransom Gillis house could be saved, maybe others could too. If Curtis could make it work, economically, practically, physically, maybe restoration wasn't impossible after all. More buildings got attention. The Stimson house found a buyer willing to invest in restoration. Other ruins got stabilized, then gradually restored. Small new construction started appearing, not replacing the mansions, but filling empty lots with housing designed to complement the historic buildings. Curtis's restoration was catalytic. Not because it was easy, it was brutal. Not because it was profitable, it probably wasn't. But because it proved that preservation was possible. It demonstrated that people would care about these buildings if you told their stories well. It showed that Brush Park could be more than ruins. The TV show did something else important. It educated viewers about preservation. Each episode explained architectural terms, construction techniques, historic context. Viewers learned why these buildings mattered, what made them special, why saving them was worth the effort. That education created a constituency for preservation, people across the country who cared about Brush Park because they'd seen its story on television. Did the TV show single-handedly save Brush Park? Number. The neighborhood's resurrection involved many factors: city policy changes, economic development, demographic shifts. But Curtis's very public, very documented restoration changed the narrative. Brush Park went from hopeless ruin to restoration opportunity. That perception shift mattered enormously. By 2020, multiple Brush Park buildings were under restoration. New construction was filling vacant lots, townhouses, apartments, mixed-use development. The neighborhood was changing again, for the first time in 80 years seeing investment rather than decline. But here's where the story gets complicated. Because resurrection brings new questions. Who is Brush Park being saved for? The new development isn't affordable housing. The restored mansions aren't for the working-class families who lived in them as boarding houses. The neighborhood is being rebuilt for wealthy residents, ironically, the same demographic that fled in the 1920s. Is that justice? Is that preservation? Or is it just another cycle of displacement where the poor get pushed out once the neighborhood becomes valuable again? Those questions don't have easy answers, but they're the questions Brush Park faces today as the ruins slowly transform into something new. Millionaire's Row today. Is this really a comeback? Stand at the corner of Alfred Street and Woodward Avenue today, and you see a neighborhood in transition. Construction cranes dot the skyline. New townhouses, modern designs with large windows and clean lines, sit next to restored Victorian mansions. Empty lots that were vacant for 50 years now have foundations being poured. Brush Park is being rebuilt. But rebuilt for whom? And as what? The new development is expensive. Townhouses sell for $400,000 and up, far beyond what most Detroiters can afford. The restored mansions, when they're sold rather than kept as private residences, go for similar prices or convert to high-end office space. Brush Park is becoming wealthy again. This should be good news, right? The neighborhood that collapsed is being saved. The mansions that rotted for decades are being restored. Investment is flowing in. Property values are rising. Brush Park is coming back. But coming back to what? The original Brush Park was exclusive, segregated, built for Detroit's wealthiest at the expense of everyone else. When it collapsed, working-class families, many of them black, moved into the boarding houses and survived there for decades. When the neighborhood emptied, a small community of residents stayed, maintaining life in Brush Park through its worst years. Now those residents are being displaced. As property values rise, long-term residents can't afford rising rents or property taxes. They're being pushed out by the same revitalization they survived to see. The new Brush Park is being built over their history, their community, their decades of persistence. This is gentrification's cruel irony. The neighborhood improves, but the people who kept it alive through hard times don't get to enjoy the improvement. They're replaced by newcomers who can afford the new prices. Preservationists face uncomfortable questions. Yes, saving historic buildings matters. But for whom? If restoration means displacement, is preservation worth it? If the choice is between affordable housing in ruins or expensive housing in restored mansions, which serves Detroit better? There are no simple answers. You can argue that preservation creates jobs, increases tax revenue, attracts tourism, all things that benefit the broader city. You can argue that letting historic buildings rot serves nobody, while restoration preserves cultural heritage for everyone. These arguments have merit. But you can also argue that Detroit has plenty of vacant land for new development, and destroying one of the few stable communities that survived the city's collapse just to restore mansions for wealthy newcomers is unjust. That argument has merit too. What's clear is that Brush Park's resurrection isn't simple. It's not just good news. It's complicated news. Positive for preservation, questionable for equity, transformative for the neighborhood's character. By 2024, Brush Park has roughly 50 occupied buildings, 12 restored historic mansions, and 38 new constructions. That's 50 buildings where there were 5 in 2000. Population is increasing for the first time in 80 years. Commercial development is returning. Coffee shops, restaurants, small businesses. The neighborhood functions again. But it functions differently than it did in 1890 or 1950. It's not primarily residential. It's mixed use with ground floor retail and upper floor housing. It's not entirely historic. New construction dominates numerically. It's not particularly affordable. Prices reflect Brush Park's proximity to downtown and its historic character. The city has designated Brush Park a historic district, providing some protections for surviving buildings. Demolition requires approval. New construction must be compatible with historic structures. These rules help preserve character, but they also increase costs and limit flexibility. The biggest question isn't whether Brush Park will survive. It will. Too much investment has flowed in for another collapse. The question is, what Brush Park will become? A museum district of restored mansions? A wealthy enclave disconnected from surrounding neighborhoods? A mixed community balancing preservation with affordability? The answer is still being determined. What we can say definitively, Brush Park's collapse was preventable. The real reason 300 mansions were destroyed wasn't automobiles or white flight or economic inevitability. It was policy choices, highway construction, urban renewal, zoning decisions, redlining, that systematically destroyed a neighborhood while claiming to save Detroit. And Brush Park's resurrection shows that preservation is possible when economics align with political will. Curtis's restoration demonstrated feasibility. Developer interest provided capital. City policy created frameworks. Together, these factors enabled what seemed impossible in 2000. But the resurrection also shows preservation's limitations. Saving buildings doesn't automatically serve the people who need housing. Historic preservation can exclude as easily as urban renewal demolished. The new Brush Park may be architecturally impressive and economically vibrant, but it's not accessible to most Detroiters. So is this a comeback? Yes and no. The buildings are coming back, investment is coming back, but the community that survived Brush Park's worst years isn't coming back. It's being displaced by the very recovery it made possible. That's the complicated truth of Brush Park today. 300 mansions were destroyed by deliberate policy choices. 12 survived through accident and persistence. Now the neighborhood is being rebuilt, but for different people, with different priorities, creating a different place. The real reason Brush Park collapsed was that Detroit chose highways over history, cars over communities, development over preservation. The neighborhood is returning now because those priorities have shifted. Preservation has become valuable, economically, culturally, politically. But value and justice aren't the same thing. Brush Park is being saved. Whether it's being saved well, saved fairly, saved for the right reasons, those questions remain open. And the answers will determine not just Brush Park's future, but whether historic preservation in Detroit serves everyone or just those who can afford it. 300 mansions, A century of boom, collapse, and slow resurrection. That's the story of Millionaire's Row. The real story. Not simple, not comfortable, but real.